Scott Lucas. This is World Unfiltered. So we will be chatting today just after the G7 summit in Cornwall, in Southwest England. Beyond the location and the fact that we had a rare burst of sunshine in the country, we had the headlines coming out, especially out of US press, that the G7 communique was a case of the G7 challenging China. As the Americans put it, a strategic confrontation. The New York Times talked about the idea that we would have a new Cold War. And I thought to myself, given that we were supposed to be talking about the coronavirus pandemic, climate change, infrastructure, development, global corporate tax rates, has the rhetoric of a clash of civilizations got us again? That the US versus China will be the theme for the 21st century beyond any specific economic, social, or environmental concern that we have. So I need some help with this. Fortunately, I remembered a book that I read a few years ago and that I went back to called After Defeat: How the East Learned to Live with the West. The author of that book is Professor Ayşe Zarakol. She is a professor in international relations at the University of Cambridge. She's much traveled, however, having studied at universities from Istanbul to Madison, Wisconsin, and worked at places such as Washington and Lee in Virginia. She has a global perspective through not only these books, but through her articles, which talk about how we can view the world from conceptions, culture, order, and from the sense of emotions. And she has specific focus, which taps into our World Unfiltered, on how we can view Turkey and how Turkey views us in 2021 and through its history. Professor Zarakol, thank you for coming here to help me out.
My pleasure.
I thought I would start with a contemporary, if we would. I referred in the introduction to this G7 meeting, which for all the global issues that were on tap, some elements in the Western press, and indeed some of the national governments, have chosen to highlight this as an us versus China moment. With this notion of democracies versus autocracies, as President Biden puts it, are we in danger, or do you see it as a danger, that we're going back to replaying the clash of civilizations narrative that existed during the Cold War and was reinforced in the 1990s?
Yeah, I think there is definitely a danger of that. And I think it should be avoided if possible. There was a recent article in Foreign Affairs by Jessica Chan-Weiss and Tom Pepinski that actually makes the point, and I agree, that there is a danger in presenting this as a global contest between different civilizations or ideologies. And it would be more productive to find points of agreement. Of course, that doesn't mean that the US or the West should necessarily be weak in terms of standing up for democracy, but the discourse of clash of civilizations itself is dangerous for the reasons that I discussed in my book that you referred to, After Defeat, and in other work. Far from being, I think, separate civilizations, the real difficulty comes from the fact that, from China's experience in the modern international order of being kind of a, secondary or a lower ranking state within the social hierarchies of the international order, the modern international order, of being stigmatized. Chinese domestic discourse makes much of, the century of humiliation, rising above that. So anything that kind of triggers these types of humiliations of the past, or kind of brings to mind, these types of discriminations, is not productive. On the one hand, academia should do more to acknowledge that these types of sensitivities and emotional, vulnerabilities exist and shape foreign policy. At the same time, foreign policy itself needs to kind of tripping that how do you call it, the hot wire, or we need to be conscious of it, but we need to also avoid activating these types of grievances.
Yeah, one reason why I really wanted to talk to you was this idea of the tripwire of stigma as it were, which is not just with China, but with a number of countries. But if I could start with the basics to sort of help me out, is it when you refer in your work to throughout in terms of East and the West, I'm going to assume these aren't fixed entities. This isn't just like a part of the world that is East and West. But do we start by understanding it as where countries are within the international system, or do we start with it in terms of that these are sort of cultural constructions that frame what we call East and West?
Yeah, I mean, they are cultural constructions. I think they are mostly a product of late 18th, maybe 19th century kind of thinking about the world that then later have been projected back into time. And of course, they change over time as well, because they are constructed categories. That's true on the one hand. At the same time, we kind of have to, because these categories exist and shape the way people think, we kind of have to use them. And every time we use them, so for instance, in my books, I talk about East and West, even though I realize that these are historically contingent categories. So every time we use the categories, we end up kind of reinforcing them. So there is a bit of a dilemma. Yeah, so yes, I mean, that's a long-winded answer to your question. At the same time, I do think, maybe something is captured when we talk about East, or, when we talk about Asia or Eurasia. These have their own political connotations. So sometimes it's better to say the East rather than, Eurasia, which comes with its own political project, or Asia, which seems to have its own. So I try to be pragmatic about the categories I use, and put footnotes and say, this is just in this discussion, this is useful. Another way of thinking about it is maybe core, semi-periphery, periphery. So in a recent article that I wrote with Rebecca Adler-Neeson, we talked about, core of the liberal international order versus the semi-periphery versus the periphery or the external actors. But that, of course, that's something that can overlap with the category of the East, the semi-periphery, but it's also something different.
Well, if you don't mind me asking something personal, as someone who has studied and worked in the US and the UK, do you feel that you are in something called the West?
That's a difficult question. Certainly, I mean, also because, I grew up in Turkey. So when Turks talk about the West, they have a particular, it's very monolithic, the West. There's this imagined gaze of the West. So once you travel from Istanbul to places associated with the West, you realize that it doesn't quite work that way. There's a lot of, variety within the West as well. I mean, I've been, as you said, in rural Virginia, which is very different from, London, which is very different from, I don't know, Oslo or something. So I don't think there is something, the West, that like explains everything. And, but at the same time, the concept of the West plays a certain role in our political discourse and in our analytical discourse. So we can't do away with it. If we completely do away with it, as mainstream international relations literature did for a long time, did not worry about these concepts, leaving discussion of the West and the civilizational discourse was kind of out of bounds. It's not proper social science. But then that leaves it to people who are even less qualified to discuss, people who use these categories to kind of foment division and discourses of superiority. So I think we shouldn't completely stay away from using the categories, because people on the street use them. So we have to find ways of, how do we analyze what the West means without necessarily ascribing to it some kind of monolithic power or some kind of substantialism.
So I guess if we get pragmatic about this, if we get practical, I mean, you've written at length about Russia and Japan as Turkey as 3 case studies, and you've referred to peoples in those countries, how they develop their own cultural conceptions. From your experience, let's say someone in Russia or in Japan, do they see themselves as being in something called the East? Where do they perceive their own position locally, regionally, and globally?
I don't think so. I mean, of course, again, this, individual experience would vary, but I think the East is even a more amorphous category than the West. I think people in the West are more likely to say we are the West than people in the East. They tend to define themselves as, they either say, oh, we are also part of the West, or we are the non-West. It's more, the referent is always the core, the West, or at least has been for the 20th century. This may be changing. So I've just finished, another book called Before the West, where I was trying to write a history of international relations in Asia and Eurasia without taking the West as a reference, without privileging, Western actors, European actors, just writing it from the perspective of people who lived at the time. And yeah, it wasn't easy. There wasn't a text of the East, you have European or Western history, but there isn't, we have Chinese history, Ottoman history, or Russian history. These threads haven't really been tied to each other. So those categories are even looser, I think. Maybe that will change in this century, who knows?
Yeah. That almost strikes me as almost like it's the West and the other, as opposed to the West and the East, right? I mean, well, in that sense, let me pick you up on that. That's an interesting possibility. Do you foresee, in terms of cultural frameworks, social political frameworks, a time when people will refer, their reference point will start with Beijing? In other words, you flip what we have, which is the reference point is, here's the West and here's me. People will look first of all at China and then say, here's me.
It is possible. I mean, I thought it was far off in the future. And then the last decade made me think that maybe it's possible in our lifetime to see this type of shift. I mean, it has happened before in history, where it was, the area that we call China was the main reference, where, conquerors would try to conquer China. I mean, of course, Jerusalem. I mean, there were a few places that, if you were powerful, you tried to conquer. So what people take as the main reference has shifted in history over time. So it could happen again, and it could shift from Europe or the West, from US to China. So I've been thinking in the last decade, because of the crises of the West, that this may happen sooner than we thought. But of course, there is, it's easy when you're in a crisis period to kind of overestimate how much it's going to change. Even with COVID and Trump and Brexit, all of that, I mean, there is a resilience because this order that we've been in, that had the West in its center, it's been with us since the end of 19th century, I would say. So it's been around for a while. It's not going to, dissipate overnight. It's kind of, it permeates the way we think about the world, the way we teach history, the way, our institutions, primary institutions are shaped. So to answer your question, yes, it is possible. And it may even happen sooner than we thought, but not tomorrow. And it will take more than China being rich or powerful, because the kind of Western domination we're talking about in the international order, it's more than just wealth. It's more about how we see the world, and that's a different kind of shift than just China becoming a great power.
You write at length about the notion of stigma as being almost like a starting point from understanding how people try to negotiate their positions. Mm-hmm. When you refer to stigma, is this a process by which someone from outside is saying that the people or communities are not worthy, or that people in those communities should become just like us? Or is it something more internal, that these communities in a way are sort of playing out their own, almost like a self-flagellation about the fact that, we're not worthy?
Yeah, it's both, but it's more the latter, the way I understand it. So I came up with, so I've written about stigma and status and recognition. And they are just concepts in the same family. I've talked about social hierarchies, and it was partly a reaction to my PhD training is in the US, and at the time, and maybe even now, international relations, the way it was taught in the US, focused very much on material factors driving, foreign policy and international relations. And of course they do. I mean, I do not deny this. Of course, material factors play an important role. But I also wanted to argue, partly because I grew up in Turkey, that actors and states, as an extension of individual actors, they also care about their social standing in the world, and whether they're recognized by others as they imagine that they are themselves. And stigma is possible in a world of social actors. So it means that you are aware of the standards of society, and there is at least since the 19th century, there's a global international society. And then if you fall short of those standards, you feel stigmatized, and you are stigmatized by other actors. But it's also an internal awareness that you are somehow falling short of whatever is considered to be normal or acceptable in that society. And so that's, and then you develop responses to that feeling of stigmatization. So one response is to say, I reject the society that judges me, so I will create my own. But that's very difficult to do, right? To create your own social standards, but some actors do try. Another more common strategy is to say, okay, I'm going to change myself, so that if I change, if I somehow conform to these standards, then maybe I will be accepted and I will be recognized. So I took that idea, which comes out of sociology and studies of social stratification, and applied it to the international, and I think it explains a lot. Of course, it doesn't explain everything, but it explains quite a bit, I think, in terms of why states act the way they do.
So in a case like Turkey, where you've written so much rich material, when it comes to, say, Turkish political leaders, do they themselves feel stigmatized, or are they exploiting that feeling of others who are stigmatized to say, look, I can make you great again. I can make you exceptional in this world. What's the process that goes through, especially with the current Turkish leadership, and how they position themselves versus this cultural process?
Yeah, I think it's very difficult for anybody who grows up in Turkey not to feel stigmatized to some degree by the standards of international society. And again, that different groups within Turkey have different attitudes towards that feeling. The current leadership, well, for the last 2 decades, AKP Erdogan, they come from a tradition that says, well, I reject, or I'm not going to try to emulate in order to gain acceptance. I'm going to, make my own rules, and then this is the way, I'm going to get respect. At the same time, they're not free from the effects of stigmatization, because the main reference remains, the West, and competing with the West and getting recognition from Western actors. So that's never fully gone away. Even at moments where Turkey seemed to turn really eastwards, they're still playing, taking that as the main audience, and those are kind of the shaping effects of 20th century, 19th century, 20th century international society. Does that answer your question? Or
yeah, absolutely. I mean, I guess it's quite, in a way, with Turkey, which has, of course, a very special geographic position, has a very special religious position where it is. I'm wondering if Turkey is always consigned to being almost in a space of limbo, in part of where it is, and in part, just to be honest with you, with leaders who I think personally have tended to take that sense of grievance amongst the population and use it to propel themselves for their own power without resolving that state of limbo that Turkey finds itself in.
Yes, I think as long as the structure of the international order remains shaped by this hierarchy that has the West in its center and Turkey kind of in this semi-peripheral, or as you say, liminal kind of place, yes, I think this pattern is likely to repeat one way or another. I mean, I've written with Gülşah Çapan on this. The Kemalist response versus the AKP response to the same fact of stigmatization. It seems very different, but they are actually still operating in the same social hierarchical structure. I mean, the real change would be if Turks could say, we don't care, or or kind of could find some kind of recognition from elsewhere, or just feel comfortable in their own position. Yeah, or if the social hierarchy shifted altogether, as we were discussing earlier, maybe eastward, but that would put Turkey in a different kind of liminal space. I don't know that would solve Turkey's recognition problems. Yeah.
I think that's the issue. Kind of reading your work and navigating it where we are right now is I'm wondering how we shift the cultural frameworks. Let's say we're not academics, but we're activists, which is so much of what I see is simply the idea of, well, I'm going to reject the Western mode.
Yeah.
And I'm going, and this comes, by the way, not just from people, say, in Turkey or people who come from the Middle East. It comes from Western anti-imperialists who say, we will embrace a China, we'll embrace BRICS. It used to be Brazil, which means you're just simply shifting one form of hierarchy for another. Is there an alternative way of rejecting hierarchy in reconceiving where we are in the world?
That's a really good question. I don't know. When I was overseeing the hierarchies project, which ended up producing in the book, we had a big debate about whether hierarchies are avoidable, and many of us academics were skeptical that you can eliminate a hierarchy altogether from human affairs, but maybe we could evaluate certain hierarchies as being better than other types of hierarchies based on their normative content, and that's that's something to think. I think we need to think more about. Completely, I think it has been in Turkish politics, a lot of stuff used to get done by saying, this is how the West does it. And because the West is doing it this way, we must do it that way. And of course, that's not a good reason to do stuff. Things should be evaluated maybe on their own merits, which is easier said than done. And the removal of that argument from the public discourse actually has made it difficult to critique, government policy, because the government says, we don't care what the West does, for instance, and then it's, so the problem of, for instance, pollution in the Marmara Sea that everybody's discussing now. If in a previous iteration of Turkey, you could say, what will the West say, or the Western tourists won't come. None of those arguments have much power now, and I'm not saying they should. At the same time, like, what do we put in their place? Is it okay to say, like, what will China say? Well, China pollutes even more. We need to find a way of making that argument that doesn't necessarily rest on external an external reference, or overcoming some kind of stigmatization problem. Maybe we the solution is to say this is really bad for future generations, and for it's a problem for in itself. It doesn't, it's, even if nobody cared, we should still fix this. But I don't know. I mean, that's easier said than done. Pragmatically, external gaze has that kind of power.
Well, it struck me again, and as we're discussing, it strikes me, and then referring back through your work, that in the 19th century, of course, more within nations, where we did have this idea, well, we'll get rid of hierarchies through a cooperative movement. Through that. Now, not sure how that succeeded, beyond the fact that we do have, of course, a string of co-op grocery stores here in the UK that still exist to this day. But I mean, is there can there be the notion of a cooperative movement to remove international hierarchies? Or do we always have to face, at the end of the day, that someone will try to make themselves, as it were, top dog?
Yeah, I think there will be actors, states. I mean, both because I think it's kind of in the way we relate to our environment, but I think some actors are more prone to this. So if we're talking about particular states that tend to have a narrative of having been powerful empires or great powers, also, you know, the way that history is usually taught kind of perpetuates the desire to impose your will on the world. So some states are more likely to want to erect hierarchies than other states. As I think it's true for individuals. You know, some individuals are more competitive and seeking recognition through hierarchy than others. So I think that problem is there, but it is. I think we could still, as you're saying, aspire to communities that are more egalitarian and distribute recognition more evenly. I mean, we've talked about, you know, the liberal international order. There's much to criticize about it. At the same time, there is this notion of, you know, equality between its members. In practice, that's not always the case. In fact, much of my work showed that, you know, in conditions of formal equality, you can still have informal hierarchy. But I think formal equality coupled with informal hierarchy is still better than formal hierarchy coupled with informal hierarchy. You know, so I think there are still scenarios to aspire to that minimize the effects of hierarchy and stigmatization. I think that's possible.
So, do we still have a viable liberal international order in 2021?
I mean, if you just look at indicators, again, material indicators, treaties, you know, trade flows, and so on. Yes, I mean, it's the liberal international order has survived. So it is an open question, I think. So looking beyond just the material indicators, I think the problem is people have lost faith in it. You know, it used to be. You know, I was just teaching this to my first years. There, for those of us who lived through it, you know, there was this, you know, triumphalism and, you know, such optimism, I think, in the 90s and, you know, before we ran into the problems of, you know, starting maybe with war on terror, and, you know, just going downward from there. So that's, you know, optimism and the self-congratulation, the triumphalism, which we used to criticize, has taken a hit, which it should have. You know, there were, again, many problems with that discourse. At the same time, people need to believe in something. You know, so sometimes, you know, unwarranted optimism is good, because unless you believe that what you're doing has a purpose, it's hard to keep it going. So the problem with the liberal international order is not, you know, I don't think it's a material problem. It's the fact that it's being attacked and being undermined from within, you know, by some of its members. And at the same time, the actors that are supposed to have ownership of it and defend it are kind of apologetic about what it is. So that's I think the issue. And maybe, you know, its time has come, you know, we could say, okay, too bad, you know, let's move on to the next phase. What worries me is what, as you were saying, you know, what may come out of, you know, China, Russia, or to replace the liberal international order may not necessarily be that much better. So that's the bigger worry.
If I could move to my home country, native country, I should say, for a moment. I was struck by an article you wrote just after the US election. So we had a president-elect Biden come in, and you were sort of talking about the notion of American exceptionalism and all the turmoil that you had with Trump. And you almost issued, as it were, a caution, almost a warning to Americans, which is, you know, don't be smug about what happens abroad, because this could happen to you again. What did you mean by that?
Yes, so I mean, my point was that the amount of institutional and normative erosion that the US experienced within 4 years. I mean, of course, some of it, predates Trump, but the speed of which it happened, I found remarkable, because in the Turkish context, I mean, Turkey was never, a very well-functioning democracy to begin with, but there were various institutional checks on, centralization of power in the in the hands of one person. So it took many, many years for those checks to be eliminated, and there was considerable resistance, and there still is. I mean, there's still, considerable resistance, which also has been interesting to see. Whereas, yeah, so I thought, U.S. democracy, because it's been around for so long and the norms are supposed to be so strong and the institutions are supposed to be so strong, the way they could be so quickly undermined by one president and who wasn't that, competent to begin with, if you forgive me saying. So that seemed worrisome, and at the same time, American civil society seemed very exhausted by having to resist this just for 3-4 years. So all I was saying is, there's a tendency in the US or in Europe to look at other places in the world and think, oh, these people, they just haven't figured it out. It's just so easy. But so much of what Americans and Europeans take for granted is just historical luck a bit, right? Also not having to fight these battles. So I was trying to remind American readers that there are people who are, standing up for democracy and rights everywhere in the world and have been doing it longer. And you shouldn't just look at the outcome. And at the same time, I think the US got lucky. I don't know, lucky is not the right word, but due to some unforeseen developments, like the way Trump handled COVID, which was not a given. I mean, he could have done a better job. I think he would have won a re-election had he performed better in 2020. And then what kind of damage would he have done with a second year? Second term in power. So I don't think anybody should take democracy and civil rights, etc., for granted. We always have to be kind of vigilant and kind of keep fighting for them wherever we are in the world.
7 months after you've written that, do you have the sense that Americans have learned any of that, or is the lesson still there to be absorbed?
I think there's a big temptation to go back to thinking that, big temptation to think that things have gone back to normal. And I understand that, because it was very tiring. I mean, not just for people in the US, for everybody, it was tiring, that period. So people also coming out of the pandemic period, they don't necessarily want to focus on politics and what could go wrong. But I don't think the danger for the US or for the world is over. There does seem to be kind of a positive wind that, maybe, there are developments also, for instance, Israel and so on, where the rise of strongmen maybe is being checked. People are now realizing that this is a global problem. So I think, our world kind of hangs in the balance. I mean, it could go either way now. I hope we don't go entirely back to status quo ante, because there were problems with that. Hopefully what comes out of this period will be an improved world, but it could also go, I think, in a very bad direction. I don't think we stop that. I think that, potential is there. We could be, it's a very frequently used kind of analogy, but it could be, we could be in the interwar years, right now. So that's also a possibility.
Well, I was looking for definitive answers, but I think you're quite right. I think we're not sure what could happen. So let me go for the big finish with this question. You talked earlier that people need to believe in something. Professor Zarakol, at the end of the day, what do you believe in?
Oh, you should you should have given me a warning that this was going to be this is the hardest question. Um, I I think I mean this is a question I thought about actually a lot this year because again because I am teaching first year university students, and the big problem that I see going back to what I said earlier is that they can take apart and criticize basically any political development in the world. They are really well versed in that, but there are very few things that they have a positive belief in. I mean, I don't say this to criticize my students. I think we are kind of all in that place. We know what's wrong with the world, but compared to our 20th century counterparts and so on, there are very few things like modernity or progress or the social welfare state or whatever that we actually like truly uncynically believe in. And maybe that's because there were so many 20th century projects that went wrong because people had this excessive idealism about what can be done. What I believe in is that we can, now that we've had this period of unbridled optimism about human agency, and then this period of deconstruction or the critical period, maybe we can come out of, I mean, it almost sounds Hegelian, but some kind of combination of both where we recover some of the optimism about what we can do. I mean, science here is there's so much, again, we can criticize, the scientific discourse, but there's so much there still. I mean, it's kind of unbelievable that in such a divided, polarized world, scientists still manage to work together and come up with the vaccine, for instance, despite the vaccine skepticism. I mean, it's very easy to focus on what's wrong, but maybe we could focus on what we are able to do without, slipping into that triumphalist, self-congratulatory kind of mode. Maybe be a little less ambitious, but not also entirely nihilistic. And then we can still have some progress with a small p, not big P, and outcomes that benefit the many. I guess that's that's what I believe, and I don't know if it's too again too vague, but that's the kind of vision that I would like to recover. Also for climate change, I think we need to find ways to work with science and with each other.
On this sunny day, I will take that. I will take that as a start. Professor Ayşe Zarakol, thank you so much for coming on World Unfiltered.
Yeah, thank you.
Let me thank all the good folks at Deep Dive Politics for keeping us on the air today. Let me thank most of all you, however, dear viewers, for joining us. Some reminders on how you can join not only World Unfiltered, but all of Deep Dive Politics work. We are on Twitter at @dive_politics. We are on Facebook at Deep Dive Politics. And if you prefer the audio version, as you're jogging or cycling or in your car, all of the World Unfiltered video cast and indeed our Deep Dive Politics snapshots are available on Spotify. But for now, with a bit of hope, again, thank you, Professor Zarakol. Y'all stay safe, stay sane, and be decent to each other. I'm Scott Lucas. This has been World Unfiltered.